Okay, today we're reading chapter 2. And if you are a person who can multitask, you can do your assignment at the same time. Your assignment you can do over chapter 2 or chapter 1, or if it like goes over both chapters, that's fine. You're answering these 7 questions in a paragraph. Um, I think the easiest way mostly is to just write a sentence for each question once you get past 1 and 2. Like for number 1, you would write something like, um, Nemo encountered the conflict when he wanted to touch the boat and everyone else wanted him not to touch the boat, right? That one sentence takes care of questions 1 and 2. But after that, you could just write a question for or a sentence for number 3, a sentence for 4, a sentence for 5, a sentence for 6, a sentence for 7, and have a cohesive paragraph. I put that this isn't due until Thursday at midnight, because in case you can't listen and write it at the same time, which is totally fine, you'll have time later. And because I didn't pre-read the chapter, so I don't know how long it's going to take, so I don't know how much time you're going to have at the end of the period. If you have anything marked 0 in the grade book, make sure that you do it, and I will grade them and put them in as soon as possible. Well, probably like the night that you do them, because not having to teach leaves a lot of time for grading. Okay, so we're going to start reading chapter 2. If you would like to follow along, you can open the PDF or you can answer this. If you would like a paper book, email me and I will have Mrs. Gibson get one to you. They are in her room, but she could drop them off so that you could have them for Thursday, right? Yes. Okay, chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort, of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Do ashes literally grow here? Like, are we literally growing ashes? No. This this valley of ashes, is between a whole bunch of factory work where there are smokestacks, and ashes land on everything. So everything is covered in ash. So it looks like it's snowing ash, or it looks like it's growing ash and everything's made out of ash. But that's just really seriously well done, figurative language, I guess, imagery. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls through an invisible track, gives out a ghostly creak, and comes to rest, and immediately the ash gray men swarm up with leaden spears and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operations from your sight. It's hard to see what's going on in the Valley of Ashes. But above the gray land and the spasms of bleak dusk which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non existent nose. Okay, well, no, let's go on. Evidently, some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into an eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little bit by the paintless days under the sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. T.J. Eckelberg's eyes are literally a giant billboard of somebody's eyes for an optometrist. Like, it's like, come see T.J. Eckelberg. And it's, well, first of all, if you talk to people who like really love Great Gatsby or really believe that symbolism is everything at all times, they will tell you that this is like the greatest symbol of all time. I think it's interesting. I think it has symbolism. I think you can find symbolism in it, but I don't think it's like life-changing symbolism. Oh my gosh. But what you see is you're driving through the Valley of Ashes and everything is gray and everything looks dirty and dingy. And then right as you can start to see stuff clearly again, there's a giant billboard of a giant face, with giant eyes. It says the retinas are 1 yard high. So think about how big, the iris, the retinas. No, the irises are part of the retinas. That doesn't make sense. And they're huge, right? So it's gray, 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 and then you see these huge eyes. And This thing is old. It seems like somebody has forgotten them. The they're I don't know, they're forgotten. They're gone away. But all of a sudden they're there. There's no face. It's just like eyes watching you. We will return to this idea later. But this is such a big piece of Great Gatsby for some people that I don't want it to go missed by you. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under the sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as a half an hour. There is always a halt there of at least a minute, and it was because of that that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular restaurants with her, leaving her at the table, sauntering about, chattering with whomever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her. But I did. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the ash heaps, he jumped to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me out of the car. Sorry, I'm really trying not to cough, but it's impossible. We're getting off, he insisted. I want you to meet my girl. Okay, Nick is Daisy's cousin, and Daisy is Tom's wife. And they're getting out in the middle of this place, and he's like, hey, I want you to meet my girl. Which most of the people I think in this entire book are despicable people that are doing despicable things and don't care about anything at all. And I try to hold that feeling in, but like, are you kidding me? I think he tanked up a good deal at the luncheon. That means he's pretty drunk. And his determination to have me company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was that on a Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. Nick probably doesn't have anything better to do, but he'd probably rather do nothing than go meet Tom's mistress. I followed him over a low whitewashed railroad fence, and we walked back 100 yards along the road under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small block of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it, and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the three shops it contained was for rent, and another was for an all-night restaurant, approached by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was a dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that the shadow of a garage must be blind, and the sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead. When the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. Hello, Wilson, old man, said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. How's business? Can't complain, answered Wilson unconvincingly. When are you going to sell me that car? Next week. I've got my man working on it now. Works pretty slow, don't he? No, he doesn't, said Tom coldly. And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else at all. No, I don't mean that, explained Wilson. I just meant Tom Buchanan is talking to this man, Wilson, about selling a car. And Tom said that he has someone who's fixing it up before they sell it. And Wilson's like, man, it's taking forever. And Tom gets mad and says he'll take his business somewhere else. His voice faded off, and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and in a moment the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from an office door. She was in the middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her surplus flesh sensuously as some women can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediate perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Then she wet her lips, and without turning around spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down. Oh, sure, agreed Wilson hurriedly, and he went toward the little office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit, and his pale hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. I want to see you, Tom said intently. Get on the next train. All right. I'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level. She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged with 2 chairs from his front door. We waited for her down the road out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad track. Terrible place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson? He thinks she goes to see her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. So Tom Buchanan and his girl and I went together to New York. Or not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers who might be on the train. So Tom goes to Wilson's garage, talks to Wilson like he's going to sell him something, but has no reason to be there other than to be like, hey, what's up? Yeah, I'm going to sell you that car, but not today. Doesn't even have a car because they walked from the train station. Then sees Wilson's wife, Myrtle, and is like, hey, meet me in New York, and then takes Nick on their date. She had changed her dress to a brown figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her to the platform in New York. As the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and a moving picture magazine, and in the station drugstore sold some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs, in the solemn, echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before she selected a new one, lavender-colored with gray upholstery, and into this we slid out of the mass of the station and into the glowing sunshine. But immediately, she turned sharply from the window, leaning forward, tapped on the front glass. I want to get one of those dogs, she said earnestly. I want to get one for the apartment. They're nice to have a dog. We backed up to a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. What kind are they? Asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly as they came to the taxi window. All kinds. What kind you want, lady? I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I don't suppose you got that kind. The man peered doubtfully into the basket, plunged his hand and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. That's no police dog, said Tom. Well, no, it's not exactly a police dog, the man said with disappointment in his voice. It's more of an Airedale. He passed his hand over the brown wash rag of a back. Look at that coat. Some coat. That dog that'll never have bother with catching a cold. I think it's cute, said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. How much is it? That dog, he looked at it admiringly. That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale, undoubtedly there was an Airedale concerned in it somewhere, though its feet were startlingly white, changed hands and settled down in Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat in rapture. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked delicately. That dog's. Let's go back. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked delicately. That dog's a boy. It's a bitch, said Tom decisively. Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it. So Myrtle and Tom are having an affair, and evidently they have an apartment somewhere, and she just bought a dog for their apartment. We drove over to Fifth Avenue, so warm and soft, almost pastoral, on the summer Sunday afternoon that I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep over the corner. Hold on, I said. I have to leave you here. No, you don't, interposed Tom quickly. Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment, won't you, Myrtle? Come on, she urged. I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She's said to be very beautiful by people who ought to know. I'd like to, but... We went on, cutting back again over the park toward the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, the cab stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. I'm going to have the McKees come up, she announced as we rose in the elevator, and of course I'll call my sister too. The apartment was on the top floor, the small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors, with a set of tapestried furniture entirely too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over the scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. Just of Versailles, sorry. The only picture was an overly enlarged photograph, apparently a hen sitting on a blurred rock. Looking at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a stout old lady beamed down into the room. Several old copies of Town Tattle lay on the table together with a copy of Simon Called Peter and some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large, hard dog biscuits, one of which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau drawer. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, although until after 8 o'clock the apartment was full of cheerful sun. All right, so this is the second and last time Nick ever gets drunk. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at a drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or just whiskey distorted things because it didn't make any sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after the first drink Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced to arrive at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid, sticky bob of red hair, the complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of an old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clinking as innumerable pottery bracelets jingled up and down upon her arms. She came in with such proprietary haste and looked around so possessively at the furniture that I wondered if she lived here. But when I asked her, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girlfriend at a hotel. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was an artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer that made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She told me with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they had been married. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before, and she was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into an impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her, until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through smoky air. My dear, she told her sister in a high, mincing shout, most of these fellows will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill, you thought she'd had my appendicitis out. What was the name of the woman? Asked Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Eberhart. She goes around looking at people's feet in their own home. I like your dress, remarked Mrs. McKee. I think it's adorable. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. It's just a crazy old thing, she said. I just slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like. But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean, pursued Mrs. McKee. If Chester could only get you to pose, I think he could make something of it. We all looked in silence at Mrs. Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eyes and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. Mr. McKee regarded her intently, with his head on one side, and then moved his hands back and forth slowly in front of his face. I should change the light, he said after a moment. I'd like to bring out the modeling of the features and try to get a hold of all of that. And I tried to get a hold of all the back hair. I cannot imagine that he's actually talking about her back hair and try to get a hold of all the back hair. Surely it should say black hair. And maybe it does. I'm reading a Kindle version off of the I got a free Kindle version. That has to be wrong. I hope that one of you is looking at the PDF right now and can shed light on this for everyone else in the room. Her husband said shh, and we all looked at the subject again. Oh no, go back. I wouldn't think of changing the light, cried Mrs. McKee. I think it's Her husband said shh, and we all looked at the subject again, whereupon Tom Buchanan yawned audibly and got to his feet. You McKees have something to drink, he said. Get some more ice and mineral water, Myrtle, before everyone goes to sleep. I told that boy about the ice, Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. These people. You have to keep after them all the time. She looked at me and laughed pointlessly. Then she flounced over to the dog, kissed it with ecstasy, swept into the kitchen, implying that a dozen chefs awaited her orders there. I've done some nice things out on Long Island, asserted Mr. McKee. Tom looked at him blankly. 2 of them that we have framed downstairs. 2 what? Demanded Tom. 2 studies. One of them I call Montauk Point the Gulls, and the other I call Montauk Point the Sea. The sister Catherine sat down beside me on the couch. Do you live down on Long Island too? She inquired. I live at West Egg. Really? I was down there at a party about a month ago, at a man named Gatsby's. Do you know him? I live next door to him. Well, they say he's a nephew or a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That's where his money comes from. Really? She nodded. I'm scared of him. I'd hate him to have anything on me. That's Catherine saying she's scared of him. This absorbing information about my neighbor was interrupted by Mrs. McKee's pointed suddenly at Catherine. Chester, I think you could do something with her, she broke out. But Mr. McKee only nodded in a bored way and turned his attention to Tom. I'd like to get more work on Long Island if I could get the entry. All I ask is that they should give me a start. Ask Myrtle, said Tom, breaking into a short shout of laughter at Mrs. Wilson when she entered with a tray. She'll give you a letter of introduction, won't you, Myrtle? Do what? She asked, startled. You'll give Mickey a letter of introduction to your husband, so we can do some studies of him. His lips moved silently for a moment as he invented. George B. Wilson at the gasoline pump or something like that. Catherine leaned close to me and whispered in my ear. Neither of them can stand the person they're married to. Can't they? Can't stand them. She looked at Myrtle and then at Tom. What I say is, why go on living with them if you can't stand them? If I was them, I'd get a divorce and get married to each other right away. Doesn't she like Wilson either? The answer to this was unexpected. It came from Myrtle, who had overheard the question, and it was violent and obscene. You see, cried Catherine triumphantly. She lowered her voice again. It's really his wife that's keeping them apart. She's a Catholic, and they don't believe in divorce. It was Nick's inner monologue. Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. When they do get married, continued Catherine, they're going west to live for a while until it blows over. It'd be more discreet to go to Europe. Oh, do you like Europe? She exclaimed, surprisingly. I just got back from Monte Carlo. Really? Just last year, I went over there with another girl. Stay long? No, we just went to Monte Carlo and back. And then we went by way of Marseille. We had over $1,200 when we started, but we got gypped out of it all in 2 days in the private rooms. We had an awful time getting back, I tell you. God, how I hated that town. The late afternoon sky bloomed in the window for a moment like the blue honey of the Mediterranean. Then the shrill voice of Mrs. McKee called me back into the room. I almost made a mistake, too, she declared vigorously. I almost married a little man who'd been after me for years. There is a slur in the book, and we'll talk about it when I get back, but I don't want to do it on video. Yeah. I knew he was below me. Everybody kept saying to me, Lucille, that man's way below you. But if I hadn't met Chester, he'd got me for sure. Yes, but listen, said Myrtle Wilson, nodding her head up and down. At least you didn't marry him. I know I didn't. Well, I married him, said Myrtle ambiguously, and that's the difference between your case and mine. Okay, so they're all drunk and it's all getting confusing. But Mrs. McKee is talking about how she almost married someone she shouldn't have, and Myrtle's like, I did marry someone I shouldn't have. And so Myrtle's trying to say that her life is harder and worse. Why did you, Myrtle? Demanded Catherine. Nobody forced you to get married. Myrtle considered. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him for a while, said Catherine. Crazy about him, cried Myrtle incredulously. Who said I was crazy about him? I was never any more crazy about him than I was about that man there. She pointed suddenly at me, and everyone looked at me accusingly. I tried to show by my expression that I had played no part in her past. The only crazy I was when I married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in, and never even told me about it. And then the man came after it one day when he was out. She looked around to see who was listening. Oh, is that your suit? I said. That's the first I ever heard about it. But I gave it to him, and then I laid down all day and cried to beat the band. She really ought to get away from him, resumed Catherine to me. They've been living over that garage for 11 years, and Tom's the first sweetie she's ever had. The bottle of whiskey, a second one, was now in constant demand by all present, excepting Catherine, who, felt just as good on nothing at all. Tom rang for the janitor and sent him for some celebrated sandwiches, which were a complete supper in themselves. I wanted to get out and walk eastward toward the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument which pulled me back, as if with ropes, into my chair. Yet high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets, and I was him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. Myrtle pulled her chair close to mine, and suddenly her warm breath poured over me and the story of her first meeting with Tom. It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on the train. I was going up to New York to see my sister and spend the night. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I couldn't keep my eyes off him, but every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head. When we came into the station, he was next to me, and his white shirt front pressed against my arm, and so I told him I'd have to call a policeman, but I knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into the taxi with him, I didn't hardly know what I wasn't getting into a subway train. All I kept thinking about over and over was, you can't live life forever, you can't live forever. She turned to Mrs. McKee, and the room rang full of artificial laughter. My dear, she cried, I'm going to give you this dress as soon as I'm through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow. I'm going to make a list of all the things I've got to get. A massage and a wave and a collar for the dog and one of those cute little ashtrays where you touch a spring and the wreath of black silk. And one of those cute little ashtrays where you touch a spring. And a wreath with a black silk bow for my mother's grave that'll last all summer. I've got to write down a list so I won't forget all the things I've got to do. It was 9 o'clock. Almost immediately afterward, I looked at my watch and I found it was 10. Mr. McKee was asleep on a chair with his fists clenched in his lap, like a photograph of a man of action. Taking out my handkerchief, I wiped from his cheek the remains of a spot of dried lather that had worried me all afternoon. The little dog was sitting on the table, looking with a blind eye through the smoke, and from time to time groaning faintly. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other a few feet away. Sometime toward midnight, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face, discussing in impassioned voice whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. Daisy, 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 shouted Mrs. Wilson. I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy, Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. Then there were bloody towels upon the bathroom floor, and women's voices scolding, and high over the confusion a long broken wail of pain. Mr. McKee awoke from his doze and started in a daze toward the door. When he'd gone halfway, he turned around and stared at the scene, his wife and Catherine scolding and consoling as they stumbled here and there among the crowded furniture with articles of aid, and despairing figure on the couch, bleeding fluently, and trying to spread a copy of the town tattle over the tapestry scenes of Versailles. Then Mr. McKee turned and continued out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed. Come to lunch someday, he suggested as we groaned down in the elevator. Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever, snapped the elevator boy. I beg your pardon, said Mr. McKee with dignity. I didn't know I was touching it. All right, I agreed. I'll be glad to. I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear with a great portfolio in his hands. Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Brook and Bridge. Nick's memory is jumpy, like him telling the story, because he's inebriated and he doesn't know everything that happened. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of Pennsylvania Station, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. Okay, that's the end of chapter 2. Do this assignment right now because you have time and get it turned in. Do any old assignments that you've missed. Everything is up to date in the grade book everything is up to date as of 9:15 Monday night. So if you've turned something in since then, it might not be up to date. Be awesome. Make good decisions. Be awesome and make good decisions. Finish your assignments. Email me with questions.